Does a water pan do anything in an offset smoker? That's what we're gonna find out. I am going to go into this store over here. It's called Wholesale Club. And in Canada, where I'm from, that's where I get my briskets. Usually select grade briskets. In Canada, they're called AA. I have a little special guest with me today. This is Jacob. Jacob, say hello to the internet. So we're gonna go in, we're gonna pick out a brisket. Maybe he'll pick out one for me. Let's get going. Okay, there we go. We all buttoned up, buddy. Where is your other glove? Where's your other glove? Where did that other glove go? Oh my Lord. There it is. Oh God. The trials and tribulations of fatherhood. Okay, let's put this on and then we'll go into Wholesale Club, bud. $42. This one looks pretty good. What do you think of this one? You want this one? Okay, he's giving a thumbs up. Let's get it. Now it's time to trim the brisket, and while I'm doing that, let me tell you why I'm doing this experiment. Let me bring you down to the brisket here. Before I do that, I just wanted to let you know that this has been pre-frozen. You can put it in your freezer for about an hour. It makes it a lot easier to trim. I just chucked it outside in this Canadian weather. It's -20 outside Celsius. So this froze in about 30 minutes. But if you don't have the luxury of living in a cold environment, then your freezer is fine. It just might take a little bit longer because your freezer is not -20. So there's about 4 different reasons, I would say, that people have justified the use of a water pan in an offset smoker. The first one is that it acts as a heat deflector. That's the allegation anyway. So it sits between the firebox and the main cooking area, and it deflects all of that radiant heat coming off of the firebox. And it prevents the brisket from burning, from drying out. That is kind of the first reason that people say to use a water pan. Second thing is that, and it's kind of related to the first one, it acts as a heat sink. A heat sink is just a fancy term for saying it holds a lot of energy. The water has a set boiling point, so depending on where you live in the US or Canada, you might have a boiling point of 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Where I live, I think it's around 207, 208 degrees Fahrenheit because I'm at a higher altitude. But you have a set temperature that the water can go up to. In my case, let's say it can go up to a maximum of 207 degrees Fahrenheit. And because it can only go up to 207 degrees Fahrenheit, it can't take on more energy from the firebox as much as, say, a solid block of steel could. A solid block of steel in the same shape and size as a water pan could go all the way up to 500 degrees and then provide a lot of radiant energy on its own that might burn the brisket. So that water pan acts as a heat sink, or so they say, and it prevents the brisket from experiencing temperature spikes and potentially getting too much radiant heat and burning. And the third one that people are saying is that it creates more moisture in the brisket. So by adding a water pan, it's creating steam and your brisket's gonna be more moist. So the way I'm gonna test that is I'm going to weigh the brisket before and after. I think that should be a pretty good indication of whether it's lost moisture or it's retained a lot. The fourth one is that, and a lot of people don't talk about this, but this is kind of my theory, is that the water pan creates better bark. And I don't know if that's the case, but for me, bark is super important, especially on a brisket. So will it create better bark? That is really what I want to find out. And in a lot of ways, I want to see if adding the water pan actually adds moisture to the environment, which is another thing that I'm going to test during this video. Using a couple of different methods. This brisket is looking pretty good actually. It's been trimmed really well. Usually I have to remove a lot more fat, but we're gonna carve it down to a 1/4 inch thickness. I'm going to remove the silver skin on the back side, and then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut it down in half So I'm gonna have a really long, skinny brisket, and I'll cook one side of the brisket using a water pan and one side of the brisket without a water pan. And I will measure the different variables. So in the case of the more moist meat hypothesis, I'll test the weight of one side before and after and compare it to the other side before and after, so with and without the water pan. For the heat deflector and the heat sink hypothesis, what I'm gonna do is I'll leave the water pan empty for one of the cooks, and I'll leave it full for another cook, and I'll see if one of the briskets, maybe the one without the water pan, if that burned more than the other one. And I'll do some temperature spikes and fluctuations, so maybe I'll go up to 325, 350 at a couple times during the cook just to really test that out. And then what else can I test? Really, the bark is just a taste test. And I'll just taste the bark on both the with the water pan and without the water pan sides of the brisket, and I'll see which one turned out better. So that is what I'm going to be testing in this video. Now I'll speed up this trimming process, and we'll get some rub on it, and we'll get it into the fridge, and tomorrow I will get these guys onto the smoker. Waking up early in the morning, my first job was to light the smoker, and it was around minus 20 degrees Celsius that day. So what I would have to do is light it somehow without taking too much time. I didn't want to use my chimney starter because I had to carry my son around on my back. I was looking after him that day. In fact, I'm on parental leave right now for the next 3 months, so I'm Jacob's full-time caregiver. So I have to basically take him wherever I am. Didn't want to expose him to a bunch of smoke, so I used my grill gun. And the grill gun is really awesome because I can start my fires in my firebox in about 60 seconds. I just dump some lump charcoal in there, and then I can just give it a hit of the grill gun for 60 seconds, leave it, let it light up, and then I start adding my splits and everything's done. Don't have to mess around with a charcoal chimney starter. My plan was to run it around 275 degrees Fahrenheit to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason I had such a large sort of band of temperature is because I wanted to test not having the water pan would diminish my ability to control the temperature spikes, and I wanted to see if it would lead to more burning. So when I test with the water pan tomorrow, I can actually have some data on that, and we can see if those temperature spikes and swings actually made more of a difference, burnt the bark, dried out the bark without the water pan than we did with the water pan. That's a long way of explaining it, but I hope you guys get what I mean. The other reason is that I am looking after my son, so I don't have a lot of time to run out and feed the fire every 15 minutes, and I didn't really prepare well enough in advance to have perfectly kiln dried splits ready that I usually do. So the fire management in this video is going to be kind of loose, probably 275, 325. Could even be well below that. I'm probably gonna have temperature control issues, but it's a good thing because we're testing it the same way on both days, with and without the water pan, and we'll see which one turns out better and if the water pan actually helps with those temperature spikes. Once the brisket was on the smoker, I inserted my meter probe just as a backup. I like the meter and I'm used to cooking with it because I can measure the internal and the ambient temperature. If you guys want one, then check it out in the description section below. They're really handy for everyday barbecuing, but I also got this Inkbird 4-probe thermometer. And what I've done is I've hooked up a little device called a wet bulb thermometer. Wet bulb temperature, basically in short, is the temperature of a thermometer probe or bulb that's covered in a wet sort of casing. It's usually a muslin casing, but in this case I'm using cotton shoelace. And it's covered in that wet soaked sheathing, and as it dries out, as the water evaporates from the wet bulb, it wicks up more water from that water pan below it. So in order not to sort of confuse the experiment, because This is supposed to be the no water pan experiment. I covered it with a bit of foil, but we still might have a little bit of water evaporating from that water pan. The second thermometer that I have is the dry bulb thermometer. That's just regular ambient air. That's what it's measuring. So it's measuring the ambient temperature coming out of the firebox and going over the brisket. The third probe that I have is the internal temperature. So I inserted the probe in the thickest part of the brisket underneath the flat and the point muscle right in the middle, and that'll measure the internal temperature. And then the final probe that I have is the surface probe. So I put it in place with some toothpicks, and that is going to measure the surface temperature of the brisket. So I can look for any correlations or differences in the surface temperature when I'm using the water pan versus not using the water pan. So once I had all of these contraptions and probes set up, I closed the smoker and I let it smoke for approximately 7 hours until the brisket came up in temperature, in internal temperature, to 165 degrees Fahrenheit. And when I checked it, the bark was set, it had a really nice color, and I was pretty sure it was time to take it off the smoker. So I covered some butcher paper with tallow, liquid tallow. It's actually leftover Wagyu beef tallow that I had in the fridge. And then I wrapped it up and I finished it in the oven. And then I took it out when it hit around 205 degrees Fahrenheit in the thickest part of the brisket underneath the flat and the point. And did my feel test, did my bend test, did my probe test, everything looked good. So I took it out, rested it at room temperature for 2 hours, and now it is time to do the taste test. All right, let's check this out. Now this has been resting for 2 hours. It's come down to about 130 degrees internal. That's when I like to slice brisket. All right. I tell you, that's some nice looking bark. Look at that bark. That's beautiful. Nice and black. I like that so far. So remember guys, this is the no water pan brisket. The fat is, feels like it's pretty well rendered. Let's cut into this guy. It's a little bit burnt on the bottom. These are really small flat slices because this is only half a brisket. It looks like the bark got a little bit too much heat. It's kind of burnt and crispy. So the bark looks pretty good. I'll just pull that apart. Pulls apart perfectly. So it's well cooked. It's just the bottom here got a little bit burnt, so probably a bit too many temperature swings. But maybe once I use the water pan tomorrow, it'll take care of that. So I'm gonna keep slicing away, making my way towards the point muscle, and I'm going to cut it down the middle like this, and continue to make some slices here. So we got the fatty point here, we got some burnt ends, we got some of the flat. So let's look at the flat first. I'll take one from roughly the middle of the brisket, so right around here, and I'll give this a taste. It's got really good flavor, very smoky. The bark is really nice. As an aside, I kind of like how you get more bark when you cut the brisket in half, just because there's more surface area. So that's pretty good, I could eat that. It's not as dry as I thought it would be. Usually when I smoke these select grade briskets, it is a lot drier than this, so I'm just gonna give this another taste. This is another piece of the flat. See how well this is rendered. The fat's pretty well rendered. It's pretty good. It's not the sugar cookie crunchy bark that I usually get when I'm smoking my Wagyu prime grade briskets. I could have probably maybe cooked it a little bit longer, uncovered, unwrapped, to render the fat out a little bit more, but it would have just continued to get really dry. And with a select grade brisket, it needs all the help it can get. So I'm gonna take one of the fatty pieces now. I'll just cut a little piece off of it. Here's a really fatty piece. Oh yeah, that's getting a bit of sugar cookie bark. There's more fat on the point end. There's a lot more fat to render and get crispy. For the second brisket, I followed the exact same cooking process as the first brisket. The only difference this time is I added a water pan to the smoker. To be more specific, I added 2 water pans directly in the cooking chamber right next to the firebox. And then I added 2 water pans directly under the brisket. I wanted to add as many water pans as I could because my theory is that if we max out the amount of water pans we can put into the cooking chamber and we get some different results with this test, then we can infer from that that by having any kind of water pan, even if it's a smaller amount than I used in this experiment, that would make a difference. So I wanted to really get some noticeable results, so I used multiple water pans. Going through this cook, I had some temperature spikes, just like the cook that I did the day before. It went up to 350 at one point because I wanted to test out whether this brisket would be better able to handle those temperature spikes because of the water pans. And other than that, I took it out of the smoker. I finished it in the oven after wrapping it in the exact same manner with the tallow and the butcher paper. I rested it for 2 hours. The only difference with this cook that I found kind of interesting, it took the same amount of time. It took about 7 hours in both cases. And I finished at around 170 degrees before I wrapped in both cases. But with the water pan brisket on day 2, I found that it was a lot tighter after the first 30 minutes when I checked it. And I had to actually cook it in the oven for an additional 45 minutes before it started to loosen up to the same tenderness as the one the day before. But the one the day before finished 45 minutes earlier. So really interesting because it's the same brisket. So I don't really have an explanation for that other than that we had different temperature swings. I was watching a video that Melissa Cookston did once, and her view was that if you have temperature fluctuations and the brisket starts decreasing in temperature and the muscle fibers are tightening up again or loosening, then that can have an impact on the final tenderness of the brisket. My other theory is that because the brisket had another day to dry brine, that could have had something to do with it, and maybe dry brining causes the brisket to need more time to finish. And finally, maybe the inclusion of the water pan, the existence of the water pan in the cooking chamber in this experiment actually caused the brisket to take longer to finish. The other interesting thing to note in this experiment is that at some point during the cook, the water pans, the 2 water pans right next to the firebox, actually completely dried out. I don't know when. I'll have to look at the data and see if anything changed in respect of the relative humidity or the wet bulb temperature to indicate when those ran out of water. So I guess if you're running a water pan and if the results of these experiments are positive and using a water pan is actually a good idea, then it probably is important to refill it every couple hours. But for this experiment, I didn't open up the cooking chamber at all because I wanted to keep things as consistent as possible. Okay, let's cut into this brisket and see what the results of this water pan test are. The fat cap looks like it actually might be more rendered or better rendered than the one yesterday. If I press down on it, it still springs back up. Oh, no, it kind of gives way right here. So this fat cap on the flat actually is a lot better rendered than the one yesterday. So with the water pan, it looks like this one's better rendered. I would normally never do this to brisket bark, but this is for the sake of science. So you can see clearly that the fat is much better rendered. On the point, or what's left of it, this had a gouge out of it just because of the brisket was poorly trimmed. Again, the fat is pretty well rendered. Okay, again, I can tell right away that this got a bit burnt on the bottom. Let's take a look at this. A little bit burnt on the bottom, and you know what? I think the reason for that is because I'm using this kind of steel baking pan, and usually I use aluminum pans or I just finish it right on the smoker grate. So I think, you know, this steel pan holds a lot more energy than an aluminum pan, and it's probably burning the underside of this brisket in the oven. So next time I'm gonna use aluminum pans because they don't hold as much energy and they probably won't burn the brisket as much. So I'll cut into this, a little bit crispy, but that might be okay. And as I mentioned, that's not the water pan's fault. That is the pan that I finished it on. You guys tell me if I'm wrong, but that looks better than the one from yesterday without the water pan. So I'm wondering if the water pan actually helps create a better smoke ring. Now what I am noticing right away is it looks like this, this water pan brisket is holding less moisture than the one from yesterday. That might just be because it took an extra 45 minutes in the oven to finish and get tender. And that really robs it of a lot of moisture. Usually I would kind of take the drippings from the pan and then I'd coat it so it would look like that. But I just want to leave it, I'll let it oxidize a little bit because that's what I did with the one yesterday and I want to keep everything consistent for when I taste it. So I'm cutting these slices a little bit thinner than the one yesterday. Yeah, this point muscle was kind of non-existent, so a little bit more difficult to cut. But let's take one from near the middle of the brisket and we'll take a bite of it. All right, so here's my observations. Keep in mind, this is just from one experiment. In order to have some better conclusions, I'd have to do this multiple times. The one that was cooked with the water pan, so the side of the brisket, the half of the brisket that was cooked with a water pan, it had a much better smoke ring. The smoke ring is way more pronounced, it's more well formed, it just looks way better. The fat is more rendered. The fat with the water pan brisket, it's getting closer to that sugar cookie texture where you bite into it and it's crunchy, but it kind of pops in your mouth. The one that I did without the water pan, it wasn't as rendered as this one. And the third observation is that the moisture between the two are very similar. I really didn't notice any difference. The one done with the water pan wasn't any juicier than the one that I did without the water pan. I'm now going to review the data because I collected quite a bit of data. I'm going to do a deep dive into it and see if I can see anything that's happening in terms of the relative humidity and the relationship between the surface temperature and the dry bulb and wet bulb temperature with both tests. And then I'll get back to you guys. All right guys, I'm done crunching the numbers and this is what I found out. I'll bring you down to my computer here. Now what I did is I imported all of the data into an Excel spreadsheet. So here's the brisket with no water pan test. So the half of the brisket I did with no water pan. I have all the temperatures of the wet bulb, the dry bulb. And what I did is I did a pretty complex calculation that involves taking the dry bulb temperature and the wet bulb temperature and then calculating relative humidity from that. So what I've done for each one of these data points is calculated a relative humidity value. So for example, when it first started, I was at dry bulb temperature 271 Fahrenheit and wet bulb of 107.9. So that works out to a relative humidity of 1%, which is really low. If you guys are familiar with relative humidity in your own home or outside, it's typically a lot higher than that. So this tells me that it's a really dry environment. This is, again, the experiment we did with no water pan. So 1%, and then, you know, it kind of goes up to 5% on average. It spikes to 12% it's at some points, typically when I open up the lid of the smoker. So you can see on this graph here, whenever I kind of open the lid, the dry bulb temperature really sinks down, but the wet bulb temperature, it's better at retaining heat. So therefore the wet bulb temperature is higher relative to the dry bulb, and that means higher relative humidity. So those are just during those little times that I opened up the lid to look in. And then with the brisket with the water pan, I did the exact same thing. And I did a graph again with the dry bulb temperature, that's the orange. And the green is the surface temperature. The yellow is the internal temperature, so it's rising. You can kind of see it's a typical brisket cook. You know, it goes up, it stalls, and then we're trying to hit 170 throughout the cook, and it just keeps on rising up in temperature after it's done the stall. So this graph doesn't really tell me that much, but when I took the relative humidity values and I kind of compared them and did some ratios, this is kind of what I found. So with no water pan, what I had in terms of average dry bulb temperature was 274 Fahrenheit. Versus with the water pan, it was lower at 261. So this could have been because, you know, just pure luck. I was just running the experiment without the water pan at a much higher temperature, just adding more splits more frequently. Or it could mean that the water pan actually absorbs some of that heat and it makes it easier to maintain a lower temperature, especially in a cheaper offset smoker like the Oklahoma Joe's. So those are the two kind of possibilities. But this does sort of support the hypothesis that the water pan allows you to maintain more consistent temperatures at a lower temperature for longer periods of time. Average wet bulb temperature, same thing. It tracks with the dry bulb. And average surface temperature, again, same thing. It's a little bit higher with the first test without a water pan. And now we get into kind of the interesting statistics here. So average wet bulb percentage of dry bulb. This basically tells us what's the ratio of the wet bulb to the dry bulb. The closer the wet bulb temperature is to the dry bulb temperature, the higher the relative humidity. So that tells us there's more humidity in the cooking environment. So you can see that with the water pan, we have a higher ratio of 51. It's got a higher percentage chance or it's just a higher humidity environment. And we can really see that with the average relative humidity ratios. So with the water pan, I was getting 5.2% average relative humidity. And without it, I was getting 5.1. So you can see there's, you know, just over a 1%, 0.1%, sorry, difference, 0.1198% to be exact. And that's in percentage points, and as an increase of the no water pan experiment, or the no water in the water pan experiment versus the water pan experiment, the average humidity went up by 2.3% overall, which is not a lot, to be honest. We put a lot of water in that environment. A lot of it evaporated off. As I said earlier, the water pans were empty when I was done the cook. And still, it didn't really even increase the relative humidity that much. Okay, time for some conclusions. Let's start off with the first theory. Based on this experiment, does a water pan increase the moisture in a brisket? The answer is no, based on what I've researched and what I've learned during this experiment. During the taste test, I didn't really notice any moisture difference. I've done previous experiments, even though I didn't get to weigh the after weight of each brisket in this experiment. I've done experiments in the past with pork loin in the oven, weighing it before and after, and it's experienced the same moisture loss whether I had a water pan in the oven or not. And this is backed up by other YouTubers, other people on the internet. You can look at Steve from Cookout Coach has a video on this. Do you want a snack, bud? This is how I keep him busy. You want that? Come on. Yeah, I know you want it. Check out Steve from Cookout Coach. I'll put his channel in the description section below. His theory is that a water pan doesn't have any effect on the actual moisture content of meat. Second theory, does a water pan act as a heat deflector or heat sink and prevent the brisket from burning? Yes, but so does just an empty steel pan without any water in it at all. As long as there's something in between that fire and all that radiant heat and the brisket, then you're gonna have some heat deflection and you're gonna have a heat sink. Does the water pan act as a better heat sink or heat deflector with water in it? Probably. And that leads me to my next sort of conclusion. Does a water pan help keep temperatures steadier and prevent temperature spikes? Based on this experiment, I would say yes, and this is probably the biggest thing that I discovered. I looked at the standard deviation and the statistical variance between the highs and lows of all the temperature swings on each test. The brisket that I cooked with the water pan had lower variance, lower standard deviation. It had lower temperatures. Basically what that means is that the highs and lows of the temperature swings were closer to a baseline average temperature. So that means that it was easier to control a steadier temperature without as many temperature spikes with the water pan. Now, that could have meant that I was just better at temperature control for some reason during that second day, and I was just adding splits more frequently and smaller splits. But it seems unlikely because I would have had to do that consistently all day, and I was really doing it the same way that I did the previous day without the water in the water pan. So I would kind of conclude that there's probably a strong possibility that the water pan does help maintain steadier temperatures, at least on a cheap offset smoker, and particularly with an Oklahoma Joe's where I personally have troubles with temperature swings. You need all the help you can get, and a water pan seems to be helping a lot. So I'm going to continue to use it probably for that reason alone. Does a water pan increase the humidity in the cooking chamber? Yes, it does, but only by a small amount. As I said before, and as you saw with the data, there was lower relative humidity with no water in the water pan, and there was higher relative humidity with water in the water pan, but only by a very small 0.1 percentage point. So there is some extra humidity in that cooking chamber, but it's still very dry. Is that extra humidity doing anything? I don't know. It could be creating a better smoke ring. You saw that there was a better smoke ring on the with a water pan brisket test. Could be creating better bark. It could be allowing the smoke to stick better to the meat. I don't really know if that's the case. I'm kind of tongue blind or nose blind or whatever you call it to smoke a little bit because I eat so much barbecue, but I didn't really notice that much of a smoky difference between each one. It kind of tasted the same to me. It just had the same level of smokiness. Moving on to the next point, does a water pan produce better bark? Maybe. The fat on the with a water pan brisket rendered a little bit better. It had a little bit better bark. That could have just been because it was a flatter brisket. The hotter air was getting over it more easily and getting to the flat where it was able to render the fat more effectively. I'd have to do way more tests in order to really conclude whether better bark is created with a water pan. But what I can tell you for sure, based on this experiment, a water pan does help with maintaining steadier temperatures, especially in a smaller offset smoker, even if it doesn't do any of those other things that people say it does. There are a couple mistakes that I made during this experiment, things that I'd like to do better in the future. I probably will do a similar experiment in the future and fix some of those errors, but this is kind of my tentative conclusions based on what I was able to find in this experiment. If you guys want to chat more about this experiment or anything else barbecue related, consider joining my Patreon page. I'll link it in the description section below. You can join there. You can get access to a private Discord chat server, and you can chat with me directly in real time, pretty much anytime, 24/7. Whenever I'm not taking care of him. So thank you so much, guys. I'll see you in the next video. It's probably going to be another brisket video. Happy smoking.